This was sent to cornydrivethrough at gmail.com from Sal, the art sensei, and he's a former guest artist of ours on the YouTube channel.
Okay. Well, then that makes some sense.
I had a question for Jim. Recently, I started doing photography and went to an indie show here in Rochester called UPW. I shot some good photos, but the darkness really hindered some of the photos, and I got a lot of grain. How did you counteract the grain in your photography back in the day in dim situations? The way that's phrased is funny. Also wondering, back in the day, how many rolls of film did you go through at one event?
Well, okay, a couple of different questions. First one, there was sometimes you couldn't do a lot. And in Louisville, I was lucky because they had bright ring lights. And also because I think I may have mentioned this before, the Tennessee territory, they almost never changed or cleaned the canvases until they had so many holes and rips, they just had to get a new one. And they had a purple canvas in Louisville because for the kids in those days, you had a 35 millimeter camera that you had to hand focus on the fly for action shots. And you had a flash unit, a flash attachment of varying kinds. I used a Vivitar 283, if anybody wants to look that up, because it recycled. See, here was the thing. Once you took a flash picture, your flash had to recycle. It had to come back on. It had to charge back up. And unless you got one that was goddamn weighed several pounds and required to be fastened onto the camera with a bracket, and even then it was a couple of seconds, you were looking at 7 to 10 seconds. So when you took your picture, you had to take it knowing that you couldn't take one for the next several seconds.
What is that like for a photographer?
Yeah.
That time in between.
I'm looking at the ready light. Come on. Because if you're in a well-lit room, it might just be a couple of seconds, but you're in the Louisville Gardens with only a ring light and a darkened arena, and you're shooting something that even if you're leaning on the apron of the ring, if they're on the other side of the ring, they're almost 20 feet away, and there's a lot of black, and that's going to drain your battery. But the Vivitar 283 had a setting that you could sync it up with the f-stop on the Canon AE1. I believe the f-stop was 4 and the setting was blue on the flash, and it was automatic up to like 22 feet. It would supposedly read everything and figure it out. Sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't. And it took 4 AA batteries, and I would go through 2 sets of batteries on a given night. They had auto winders back in those days, a thing that you put on the bottom of the camera so you didn't have to wind it by hand to the next frame of the film. And so you could just sit there and go and take pictures, but it didn't help the flash any. So that was good for sports photography in daylight outside, like baseball, football, whatever. But you would outrun your flash, so you couldn't use those for wrestling unless you were using high-speed film and didn't use a flash at all, which was an option. That's where you really got grain, because in those days, the color film that was standard use, Kodachrome, was 100 ASA, and the black and white was 125. The ASA determined how sensitive it was to light. And if you were going to shoot color slides, I think it was like a 60-something back then. So you needed a lot of light or a flash indoors with that type of film. If you got up to a 400 speed film, as they said, then you didn't have to use a flash, but that's where you had to have some type of light on your subject. You've seen the old newspaper photographers' pictures from the 60s and 70s, where you could tell they weren't using a flash, they were using high-speed film, and the shadows and things could be dramatic, and it could really look cool, or you didn't have enough light of any kind, and you just got shit, and you got blurriness because you had to use a slower shutter speed. because there was no goddamn automatic bullshit for all this like there is today. Have I bored everybody yet? And here's another thing. In Lexington, at Rupp Arena, they started using a white mat, a bright white canvas with really bright ring lights. And that was too much light for the flash. All my action shots were getting blurred because there was too much light and it was everywhere. So I went to a high-speed 400 speed film and shot with no flash and got some cool, different motif pictures that way. But then when they changed back to a fucking purple canvas, the purple canvas soaked up all the light, and my high-speed film with no flash was shite and had to go back to using a flash. It was a process, Brian.
What was the darkest room you ever shot?
I tried a couple times to shoot. I didn't go to Nashville much, but I tried to shoot there a couple times when I was going through on the way back and forth to Memphis, and it wouldn't turn out. It was too dark at the fairgrounds. They had ring lights and nothing else, because I don't know that they had exit signs lit up in that building back in those days.
So the first time you went to the television studio, was that the brightest room you had ever shot wrestling in?
Oh yeah, well, and now the TV studio, you had to use they didn't want you to use a flash because it would fuck the cameras up. And I knew that ahead of time, but because it was lit so well and so professionally, you could use the 400 speed black and white or color film, and it hardly would even blur in the on the action shots because you could use maybe even a higher shutter speed than you were using with the flash unit. You had to use 1/60th of a second with the flash attachment.
How did you learn so much early on other than trial and error? Was there anything you read? Was there anyone you talked to?
All the photography magazines. There were like 4 or 5 different photography magazines back in those days, and because they had different magazines on everything, because people actually read shit. And I just started buying all the fucking photography magazines, and I got the Time Life photography book series, and applied they were telling me how insect photography was done and portrait photography, whatever. I just applied what I needed or what I could get out of that to what I needed. But I kind of, just picked that up.